The date was August 30th, 1945. The skies above Japan's war-torn cities, once filled with the haunting roar of enemy aircraft, were now eerily silent. Yet high above, a different kind of aircraft took flight, the American B-29 bombers. But these were not the warplanes that had become infamous for their deadly payloads. This time they carried something unexpected: food. For the civilians below, this was a sight like no other. A scene that would etch itself into the collective memory of a nation that had just emerged from the crucible of war. The B-29s, symbols of American technological might and the destructive power unleashed on Japan's cities during the Pacific War, flew over regions that were struggling to survive in the wake of surrender. Japan had just formally capitulated after the atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. The terms of surrender were signed, but the war's true cost, the devastation of civilian infrastructure, the collapse of the nation's economy, and the crippling shortages, was only beginning to unfold. The Japanese population, already reeling from months of famine and deprivation, was on the brink of starvation. Civilians across the country, already haunted by the brutal realities of wartime, had long been accustomed to the thunderous sounds of enemy bombers. These planes had carried death, destruction, and terror, dropping bombs that leveled cities and claimed thousands of lives. But the planes that appeared in the sky that late August morning were different. This time they carried crates of food. Packages of rice, flour, powdered milk, and canned goods rained down, scattered like a strange, benevolent gift from the sky. It was an act that stunned the Japanese population, leaving them in shock and disbelief. For a nation that had spent years enduring the horrors of war, the sight of American planes overhead, not dropping bombs but provisions, was unfathomable. Japanese civilians, who had been conditioned to fear and despise the American enemy, now found themselves staring at a strange and unexpected symbol of mercy. The food drops, part of a larger humanitarian effort to aid a broken nation, were met with confusion. Why would the Americans, who had fought so fiercely and caused such devastation, now extend a hand of kindness? Was this a sign of humiliation, or a genuine attempt to assist the people they had fought against for so long? The images of Japanese civilians, men, women, and children, scrambling to collect the packages of food became iconic. Their faces, marked by exhaustion and disbelief, told the story of a people who had endured unimaginable suffering. For months, the Japanese had endured the hardships of wartime rationing, their diets severely limited, their health deteriorating. The food drops were a lifeline, but they were also a stark reminder of the war's consequences. The planes that had once rained down destruction now brought a glimpse of hope. Yet the civilians remained uncertain. Was this simply a fleeting gesture, a momentary act of goodwill, or was it the beginning of something larger, a chance for recovery in the wake of utter defeat? The Japanese government had long been focused on wartime survival strategies, and the population had adapted to the grim realities of hunger. But after Japan's surrender, the country faced a new challenge: how to rebuild in the wake of total defeat. The B-29s, now flying with cargo bays filled with food, represented the first real sign of assistance from the victors. To many Japanese, it was an astonishing contrast to the brutality they had endured. The planes were not the harbingers of death they had come to dread, but rather a symbol of something more human. This moment, as strange as it seemed, marked the beginning of a new chapter in the Pacific War's aftermath. As the food dropped from the planes, the Japanese people began to realize that the war had ended. But the struggle for survival was far from over. The food drops continued over several weeks, but they were not without their challenges. The logistics of delivering aid in a country that had been ravaged by bombs, fire, and hunger were immense. The American planes were operating in unfamiliar terrain, flying over cities that were little more than rubble, and trying to deliver their packages in a way that would benefit those most in need. The drops were far from perfect, often leading to chaotic scenes on the ground. Some packages fell into the hands of the desperate, while others were lost in the chaos of an unfamiliar process. Despite the challenges, the food drops were a symbol of the potential for recovery. The American planes, once the harbingers of death, had become agents of survival, bringing with them not just food, but the possibility of rebuilding a nation. For the civilians who watched in disbelief, the planes were a reminder that the war had ended, but the world was still full of surprises. The very same people who had fought against them now seemed to be offering a chance for renewal. For the first time in years, the sky above Japan held something other than the threat of war. But this act of kindness was not without its critics. Among the Japanese military and political elite, some saw it as a humiliating reminder of their defeat. Others questioned whether the Americans were offering food out of true generosity or whether there was an underlying motive. Some believed that the food drops were simply a way for the Americans to demonstrate their power and control over a broken Japan, a way to show that they held the future of the nation in their hands. But for the ordinary civilians, the food was a lifeline, a gesture that defied expectations and defied the narrative of the war. The act of American planes dropping food over Japan was a moment that would leave a lasting impact on both nations. For the Japanese civilians, it was a moment of confusion but also of hope. It marked the beginning of a difficult journey of rebuilding, both physically and emotionally. For the Americans, it was a moment that reflected the complexity of victory, that even in the aftermath of war, acts of mercy could become as significant as acts of destruction, and as the last of the food drops fell from the planes, the question lingered in the minds of the Japanese people. Was this the start of a new era of peace, or merely a fleeting moment of kindness in the shadow of war's devastation? The answer, as history would reveal, would lie in the years to come. The Americans had made their intentions clear. They wanted to help Japan rebuild, but the journey to recovery would not be simple. The food drops were just the beginning of a much larger effort, one that would require cooperation, patience, and a deep understanding of the challenges facing a nation in ruin. For the United States, the decision to offer aid was part of a broader strategy, one that aimed not only to provide immediate relief, but also to secure long-term stability in the Pacific. In the months following Japan's surrender, American military planners shifted their focus from combat to reconstruction. The devastation wrought by years of war left Japan's infrastructure in tatters, its economy on the brink of collapse. While the food drops were a vital first step, they were just one piece of a much larger puzzle. The American occupation, led by General Douglas MacArthur, would be instrumental in reshaping Japan's political, social, and economic systems. But for the civilians who had endured the horrors of war, this was a time of great uncertainty. The American forces, initially seen as conquerors, were now tasked with the delicate work of rebuilding a broken nation. The food drops, symbolic of the shift from enemy to benefactor, were part of a broader program of aid that would include the rebuilding of critical infrastructure, the provision of medical supplies, and the establishment of new economic policies. MacArthur's team worked alongside Japanese officials to address the immediate needs of the population. But the true challenge lay in the long-term process of healing a nation that had been ravaged by war. The food, however, was not only a practical necessity. It carried with it an emotional weight that transcended its physical value. For many Japanese civilians, the sight of American planes dropping supplies was a reminder of their defeat. It was a bitter pill to swallow, knowing that the very people they had fought so fiercely against now held the key to their survival. Yet despite the discomfort, the food was a lifeline. It allowed families to endure through the worst of the post-war famine, offering them the strength to rebuild their lives. The act of receiving aid from the enemy was a profound shift in the psychological landscape of post-war Japan. As the food drops continued, Japanese civilians began to adjust to this new reality. The American presence, once feared and loathed, was now seen as a necessary force in the rebuilding process. The act of dropping food from the sky became a symbol of the larger American commitment to reconstruction, even as the country's military leaders continued to struggle with the implications of surrender. The Japanese Imperial Army, once a proud and powerful institution, was now relegated to the background, and the occupation forces took on an increasingly dominant role in shaping Japan's future. In this delicate balance, the food drops represented more than just a practical act of survival. They were a symbol of the power dynamics that would define the post-war world. The Americans, who had previously dropped bombs on Japan, were now dropping food, a stark contrast that would forever shape the way the Japanese viewed their former enemies. But while the food provided temporary relief, it did little to address the deeper psychological scars of the war. The Japanese people, traumatized by the atomic bombings, the destruction of their cities and the loss of life faced an uncertain future. Could they reconcile with their former enemies? Could they rebuild a shattered nation? Or would they forever be haunted by the horrors of the past? As Japan began to rebuild, the food drops came to symbolize not only the generosity of the American forces, but also the complex nature of victory. The Americans had won the war, but now they were faced with the difficult task of ensuring that victory would lead to lasting peace. The food that fell from the sky was not just a means of survival. It was an invitation to cooperate, to rebuild, and to work together for a future free of the devastation that had defined the war years. In the months following the end of the war, the American food drops became less frequent, but the legacy of that initial gesture would linger in the minds of the Japanese people for years to come. The drops were a moment of unexpected kindness, a moment that stood in stark contrast to the violence and destruction that had defined the previous years. For the civilians who had witnessed the sight of American planes overhead, the food drops were a symbol of both mercy and the power dynamics that would shape the new world order. But the road to recovery was far from easy. The post-war era in Japan was marked by hardship, scarcity, and a profound sense of loss. The food that had been dropped from the sky provided a temporary reprieve, but it was the efforts of ordinary people, working alongside the occupying forces, that would ultimately allow Japan to rebuild. The food drops were just the beginning, a small but significant step in the long process of healing and reconstruction. The efforts to rebuild Japan after the war were not just about restoring infrastructure and providing aid. They were about rebuilding the spirit of a nation. For the Japanese civilians who had endured the ravages of war, the food drops were a small but meaningful gesture of hope. They had been delivered to a broken nation, but in time they would help nourish the country back to life. The story of the food drops, of planes flying over devastated cities to deliver packages of sustenance, would remain a poignant reminder of the complexity of war and peace, and the strange, unexpected ways in which nations can rise from the ashes of destruction. As the post-war years unfolded, the question lingered: could Japan truly heal from the wounds inflicted by war, or would the scars remain forever? The answer would take time to unfold, but for now the food drops remained a powerful symbol of the beginning of that process. They were a reminder that even in the darkest of times, there is the potential for acts of kindness and generosity to emerge from the most unlikely sources, and that even in the aftermath of war, there is hope for a better future. In the years following Japan's surrender, the food drops were remembered not only for the immediate relief they provided, but also for their symbolic importance. The American occupation forces, led by General Douglas MacArthur, faced a monumental task in rebuilding a shattered nation. Yet the food drops were just the beginning of a much larger strategy that would aim to rebuild Japan politically, economically, and socially. As the country struggled to recover from the war's ravages, the United States played a pivotal role in shaping its future. MacArthur's leadership would define the early years of the American occupation. His task was not just to enforce surrender, but to guide Japan through a complete transformation. Under his direction, the American occupation would implement sweeping reforms, changes that would influence Japan's political structure, economy, and society for generations to come. The food drops, initially seen as a temporary solution to the crisis of famine, were part of a larger humanitarian effort designed to stabilize the country and ensure that Japan's civilian population could survive the immediate aftermath of war. Yet, the emotional weight of receiving aid from their former enemies was not lost on the Japanese people. The food drops represented a stark contrast to the way the Japanese had viewed the Americans before the war. Throughout the Pacific conflict, the Japanese military and civilian population had been told of the brutality and savagery of the United States. To now be on the receiving end of aid, not in the form of bombs or bullets but in the form of food, left many civilians confused, humbled, and in disbelief. For many, the realization that their enemies had turned into their saviors was a deeply psychological blow. This dissonance, however, would serve as the foundation for a deeper understanding between the two nations in the post-war years. As food was distributed to starving families, the American authorities began to implement the reforms that would reshape Japan into a modern, peaceful nation. Among the most significant changes was the dismantling of Japan's imperial system. Under MacArthur's direction, Japan's emperor Hirohito was stripped of his divine status and redefined as a symbolic figurehead. This marked the end of centuries of feudal rule, and with it came the difficult task of reorienting the Japanese people to a new identity. In addition to political reforms, Japan's economy had to be rebuilt from the ground up. With factories destroyed, industry crippled, and labor forces decimated, the country faced the daunting challenge of recovering its economic vitality. The United States played an essential role in this process, providing economic aid, including the famous Dodge Plan, which injected capital into Japan's industrial base and laid the groundwork for the country's rapid recovery. But it was the food drops, in their small way, that set the tone for the type of support that would come in the years to follow. They were not just acts of charity, they were part of a larger vision for Japan's future. As the American occupation forces settled into Japan, the relationship between the two nations began to shift. The food drops, initially viewed as a practical necessity in a country facing starvation, became emblematic of the broader efforts at reconciliation. The civilians who had once feared American power now began to see the United States not only as a former enemy, but as an essential partner in Japan's recovery. Over time, the American presence, once seen as an occupation, would transform into a stabilizing force that helped Japan transition from a militaristic empire to a peaceful, democratic state. But the challenges of reconstruction were far from over. The American presence in Japan, while crucial to the country's recovery, also left a mark on the national psyche. For some, the sight of American soldiers patrolling the streets, overseeing the distribution of aid, and enforcing peace represented a bitter reminder of defeat. For others, it was a sign of hope, a symbol that Japan's future could be rebuilt with the help of those who had once been their adversaries. The process of healing would take decades, and Japan's path to full recovery would be long and difficult. Yet the food drops, which had been seen as a temporary gesture, would be remembered as a key moment in Japan's post-war history, a moment that signaled the beginning of a new relationship between two former enemies. Over the next several years, the Japanese people, once war-weary and deeply distrustful of the United States, began to rebuild their nation from the rubble of the conflict. The food drops, while never intended to be a long-term solution, had provided a crucial first step. They allowed the Japanese to survive the immediate aftermath of war and gave them the strength to begin the arduous task of reconstruction. And as Japan rebuilt, the American forces began to withdraw, leaving behind a country that was well on its way to becoming an economic powerhouse. The food drops, though small in comparison to the broader efforts of occupation, were a symbol of a larger transformation. For the American forces, the food drops marked a unique chapter in the Pacific War. In the final months of the conflict, American planners had turned their attention not to continued fighting but to rebuilding. They understood that victory in the Pacific did not just mean defeating the enemy, it also meant ensuring that Japan would not become a breeding ground for future conflict. By providing food, humanitarian aid, and assistance in rebuilding infrastructure, the United States set the stage for Japan's reintegration into the global community. The food drops, part of this larger plan, were one of the first steps in demonstrating America's commitment to this new role. For the Japanese people, the food drops became a symbol of the end of war, but also of the beginning of a new era. The relationship between Japan and the United States, once defined by animosity and violence, was being rewritten. And as the years passed, the food drops, those seemingly small packages of sustenance falling from the sky, would be remembered not only for their immediate impact but also for the larger narrative of recovery and transformation that they represented. In the end, the food drops were more than just a means of survival. They were the catalyst for a much larger shift. For Japan, they marked the beginning of a new chapter in its history, one where former enemies would work together for a common future. And for the United States, they represented the moment when victory was no longer about destruction, but about rebuilding a world broken by war. The food that had fallen from the sky was more than just nourishment. It was a symbol of hope and the potential for a better, peaceful future.